Before we move on, I just want to differentiate again between event listeners and event handlers. That on-click property is the event listener property being used in this situation. It's essentially like any other property we would use on a button, like text content, for example, or style. But in this case, we know it's a special type of property because when we set it equal to some code, we know that code will be run whenever the event fires on the button. So just bear in mind that on-click is the listener. That boom, of course, is the actual event handler. But okay, you've got it. Let's move on. We've seen inline event listeners. It's now time to look at inline properties. And again, with inline properties, we're going to need our HTML and we're going to need JavaScript. But as you'll see, our code is written slightly differently. With the HTML, we literally just have a button element. How easy and intuitive is that? We've got no extra code. It's not as messy because we've just got a button element with click me text in between the tags. Simple enough. Our JavaScript then has to be a bit more complicated, but at least it's together and in one place. So the first thing we have to do, and we've seen this in part 1 of our series, we know this. The first thing is we have to grab that button, and here we start at the document, the root of our web page. We access a property called query selector, and of course we grab our button. Now within our JavaScript, we can add an inline property called, you guessed it, onClick. And remember that inline property is very special because when that event fires, it automatically runs the code that we assign that property to. Here we're assigning the code alert boom. Let's check it out in our coding editor. Now we want to look at inline properties and how they work. So let's delete our code from the previous example here. And let's start just with our button. And of course, our HTML now is even simpler, right? We've literally got a button called click me. But at this point, we haven't attached any listener, any event listener to this element, have we? No. And that's why our JavaScript gets a bit more complicated in that sense, but then at least all our code is in one block. It's not split between the HTML and the JavaScript. So the first step is to create our script tag as we saw in the example. And step 1, grab your element. Here we want to grab our button because that's what we want to attach an event listener to. Let's just call it button, btn. And of course, we're very familiar with this from part 1. We have to start at our document object. We then access a property called query selector. Of course, we can do it in other ways. This is the way I want to use, and we want to access our body element. So there we go. We've literally got our element. What's the second step? Do you remember? Well, that's right. We have to add the event and code to execute. So it's pretty simple. We just grab our button. We then want to add a property to it called onClick, don't we? And again, that onClick word is given to us by the DOM API. And remember what happens when this click event is fired? The code that we assign this onClick property to will automatically be run. So that's what we have to do now. We have to assign it a block of code. Here I'm going to be using the new arrow syntax. If you don't know what that is, don't stress, I've got you covered. I've done a whole course on JavaScript where I talk about stuff like this. It's actually called the JavaScript Complete Grandmaster course. Please check it out. But if you know it already, let's move on. So here we go. So there we go. And of course, inside these curly braces is where the beef, the heart of our code belongs. And yes, I know in this instance it's not very beefy because all we are doing is we are alerting boom to the screen. So there we have it. This is an inline property. And it's called an inline property because, well, think about it this way. Our HTML is just standard HTML. We do nothing special. But in our JavaScript, we add this inline property called onClick. And it doesn't always have to be onClick. There are a whole plethora of things we can add. Here we're just looking at the onClick event. We have to add that as a property to our button. And then of course we define the code that is executed when that event is fired. If we go back to our browser, refresh. Let's click this button. And there we go. Boom.
Mission completed.